Okay. Hi guys. Haven't uploaded in a while. This is, I guess, face to face. Have a couple of blank ones on YouTube, but I think this is better. So the topic that I'm going to be discussing today is going to be God's ultimate attribute. We all know that God has different attributes. He has very many different parts of Him. Of course, that's how we see it. All these things work in unison and complete harmony inside of God. We have His infinite wisdom, His power, His omnipresence. Then we also have like His characteristics, which are love, mercy, wrath, faithfulness, forgiveness. All these things are attributes of God. So we're not going to be dealing with his potent, I guess, his uniquely God attributes. Like I'm a man, and I can't express all power. You know what I'm saying? I also can't express infinite wisdom because I'm a finite being. So we're not talking when we're talking about God's attributes. We're talking about His characteristics, not necessarily who He is. Of course, I believe who God is His characteristics, not necessarily what He's able to do or the things that are basically only true of God, which would be omnipresence, infinite, eternal. These things are only true of God, and that's not what we're going to be discussing. The main thing we're going to be discussing is His ultimate characteristic. So, if He does have one, because many people believe God doesn't have an ultimate characteristic. Of course, ask yourself, or if you've never even thought about it, pause and just ask yourself, man, does God have an ultimate characteristic? Something that is true of Him that extends everywhere. I've meditated, I've asked God lots of questions, and for me, there was never really any doubt. Like, God has always led me in one direction, and that direction has always been towards love. So I believe that God's ultimate attribute is love. It ultimately dawned on me one day when I was sitting in philosophy class, when I was listening to the professor. He was not preaching while he was teaching, but I mean, I heard them as the words of God. Obviously, like God was trying to open my understanding to something. But Plato, he's a philosopher, and he had very profound beliefs. If you've never studied Plato, you should study his metaphysics and his belief system. And specifically, if you study the early church fathers, they all followed in Plato's footsteps. Like they took his metaphysics as Christian doctrine, like, and they expounded on it, and they did wonderful things with the metaphysics of Plato. It's a good read. Just look it up. It's very interesting stuff. But ultimately, he believed that God's ultimate attribute was goodness, and he derived this obviously from logic and reasoning. And I could not fault him. Like if you study him, if you even study the world, I mean, God made the world good, and here it is, this philosopher who doesn't speak on God's behalf, but I do believe God did inspire him. It's a whole other topic, but here he is saying that God's ultimate attribute is goodness, and he believed the same things we believe. He believed God is one. He believed he had a supernatural encounter with God, and that God would help him understand the world. That's very profound because this is not a prophet. This is pretty much a philosopher, and I think that the philosophers were similar to the prophets of old. The philosophers actually, they try to shine light. I mean, there is light in the world. I mean, God made everything to reach and find us. It's a verse in Romans or Acts. Yeah, it's a verse in Acts where it says that God made everything in your circumstances where you were born, when you were born, that you might grope to find Him. And it's the same way with this philosopher Plato. I believe that God did find this person, and that he was helped by God in order to refine metaphysics at the time. So it's just a thought. It's a radical thought, but again, study some of the stuff that he believes, and you're going to see it's true. I mean, it's really the only thing. I can show you verses from the Bible, like biblical verses, and then stuff that Plato said, and you're going to be like, wow, was this guy a Jew? Was he inspired? Was he a prophet? It's very interesting stuff. But I do believe that just like the Jews, they missed something. And of course, it's impossible to reach the fullness of God when Jesus hasn't come yet. You see what I'm saying? Like Israel, they had prophets, of course, but nobody like Jesus had ever come. So that's the one beautiful thing about Jesus, is that when he came, he changed everything radically. And that's the biggest thing is Jesus is God's ultimate revelation to us. It says that in Hebrews, that he is the radiance of God's glory, the exact representation of his nature. So if you want to find out who God is and what his ultimate attribute is, if he does have one, then I would say look at Jesus, look to Jesus. And that's what, Christians have been telling us to do for the longest time, and see what Jesus ultimately represents to you. So to me, in my experience, there was never really any doubt. I've been to several churches, and they believe God's ultimate attribute is holiness. And I could see where they could glean something like that, and it was amazing that they never discussed this, but they all came to the same conclusion, that God's ultimate attribute was holiness. And that's a beautiful thing. We're supposed to be of one mind and one heart towards God. But I don't believe specifically it's holiness. I could see how they could come to that conclusion. What do the angels say about God? They call him holy, holy, holy probably every single second of every single day. But we experience him differently. There's things that angels long to look into that we understand innately about God. That's a verse also, I believe, in Hebrews. I'm not exactly sure. But there are things that angels long to look into that we understand about God, and that's his love. I believe God's ultimate attribute is God's love. The reason I believe that is because some of the words of Jesus. Jesus said, and remember, this is Jesus' primary focus, especially if you read the book of according to John, which I believe reveals the heart of Jesus. This was the disciple whom Jesus loved. He had a very close relationship with Jesus, a very affectionate relationship with Jesus. And I don't know why, I guess God just chose to love him. Jesus specifically, favor him with affection rather than the way he treated all the other disciples. So you really do see his heart towards us in the things that God reminded John of to speak to us in the Bible. So if you really look at it, what is it that Jesus tells his disciples? He says, "A new commandment I give you, that you love one another just as I have loved you." This is the only commandment, as far as I'm aware of, that God gives us, specifically Jesus Christ. He sums up the Old Testament and he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. So he sums that up, but again, that's the Old Covenant. What is the commandment that Jesus has given us? And it's I believe the commandment to love one another just as he has loved us. In other words, self-sacrificial love. He sacrificed his life in order to pay for all of our sins, and that's why we go to heaven. Jesus' entire life was lived to serve us. And that's the type of love that we're supposed to demonstrate to others. We're supposed to regard one another as more important than ourselves, just like Jesus. When he came down to earth, he regarded us as more important. He didn't regard equality with God something to be grasped, even though he was equal with God and is equal with God. What he did was he humbled himself, and he basically, he washed his disciples' feet. He lived, breathed, and died for them. He was tired at times. He would go without food, but it was always the people that he was concerned with. And there's very many more verses. Like if you look at after his death, he comes back in resurrection and he talks to the disciples. What does he ask Peter? He asks him, "Do you love me?" 3 times. There's a really interesting thing about agape and phileo in there. It'd be good to check that out. But one of the things is agape love is God's love. And he was telling him, if you love me, then you will tend the sheep. You will tend the flock. And of course, it must have hit Peter so hard, when he heard that, because again, remember what the stuff that Jesus is going on telling people. He was telling people, I am the shepherd and this is the flock. The good shepherd lays down his life for his sheep. He's like, man, I really don't want to do that. He knows. He knows he's going to have to die. He knows, because Jesus already set that example. And that's what they were doing. They were seeing what Jesus was doing, and then they were imitating it. So Jesus performed miracles, then he gave them the power to perform miracles, cast out demons and whatnot. So he knew that his time was coming shortly and he was going to have to give his life for the sheep. And that's a beautiful and a wonderful thing that he got to experience, but it's not something he was ready to hear. And of course, you can see his attitude towards it, but he knew that that was ultimately, if God does it, then who are we to complain about it? You see what I'm saying? Like, if God's lived his entire life serving others, I can't really say anything to him. Like, he shuts me up. Every time I don't want to help somebody, God's like, well, what did Jesus do? Not what would Jesus do, what did Jesus do? And I think that's a very important distinction, because he did do it. Not that he would do it, he did do it. So we have his life as an example, and also it's what God has been doing from the beginning of time. He's been serving us. It takes energy. Can you imagine the amount of energy it takes to continue to keep us going? I mean, all those molecular processes, you don't think that you think they just happen? Like, God made a continual system and he doesn't have to check in on it? Like, there's no system like that. There's no natural system like that. Like, God is intimately involved in keeping you alive. He's using his power, and of course it's infinite, but he is using his power to keep you alive and sustain you. What does God tell the Jews? Specifically Jesus, God the Father through Jesus. He tells the Jews, my Father has been working until now. So it is work to keep you alive. That's a beautiful and a wonderful thing. I don't know if many people have caught that, but it is a work. But it's not a labor done in duty. It's a labor done in love. So those are one of the things. Another thing is, if you look at Paul's writings, God is telling us through Paul that if we have all knowledge, that we know all the mysteries of God, and we don't have love, we have nothing. Something I experienced very recently, obviously. God shares a lot of knowledge with me, but if it's not filtered through love, then it's just going to be garbage. It's going to be like a clanging sound, like nobody's going to care. And of course, God's infinite attributes, they can't be like knowledge. Knowledge corrupts. We know knowledge makes arrogant, but love edifies. Another verse also in Corinthians. And we know that if you keep forgiving people, because it's not necessarily forgiveness either. Forgiveness is just an aspect of love. If you forgive people, it's not always the best thing. What was God always doing to the Jews? He was continually forgiving them and passing judgment over on them until it was time where he couldn't take it anymore. And what did he do? He judged them, and he judged them harshly. So that's the thing that I want you guys to think about is all these things that you look at, God's justice, God's mercy, God's forgiveness, his patience, all these things are attributes of love. What does God tell us? That love is patient, love is kind, love does not seek its own. It doesn't take into account a wrong suffered. Like, all these things are a part of love, but they never fully encompass love. Because if a father never trains up his child in righteousness, he doesn't love him. But God does do that, obviously. Like, what father is it that doesn't discipline his children? So God, he is involved in disciplining us and training us up in righteousness. All these things are labors of love for God. And I think that you can see that. Whereas holiness would never lead to discipline. Holiness would lead to wrath and condemnation. We know this. God uses love to lead us to a more holy life. So that's beautiful. But holiness is not the ultimate goal in our lives, because we're never going to be completely holy until Christ comes back and gives us a new body. And that's when our bodies are going to represent his bodies as well. Like, we're going to have the perfect glorified body, and we're never going to be completely holy until that time. And then, of course, we're going to reign with Christ. But, I mean, holiness is not God's ultimate attribute. I don't believe it can be. And the reason why is from holiness begets wrath, holiness begets separation. And that's not what Christ came to do. He didn't come to separate. He came to unite, namely his bride to himself, and then us, his bride, to God. So I think that that's a profound distinction. I think holiness is the most that people can see in the Old Testament, because we see God cutting people off in the Old Testament. He cuts some Jews off, and he cuts the wicked off. I can see how you can see holiness in the Old Testament, but Jesus is something greater than what has been revealed in the Old Testament, and that's ultimately his love. The biggest thing that I guess you can look for is The Greek word agape. When you look in John 5, I believe, it says that God is love. Now, okay, we also say God is good, right? And then people say all the time. So, yeah, we say that. But when we say that, it's not necessarily, number one, it's never what the disciples said. And it's not what I've experienced. God works everything out to our good. But if everything was good, he wouldn't have to work everything out for our good, if this makes sense. So there's a verse in, I believe it's Romans 9, where it says, Romans 8, for we know that God causes all things to work together for our good. So that's the particular verse that I'm talking about. In other words, if God ultimately always treated us good, then we wouldn't have discipline. Discipline is a good thing, but we also wouldn't have suffering. These are all good things, don't get me wrong. Like, as a Christian, when I'm not suffering, when I'm not experiencing like trials and tribulations, I look back on those and say, hey man, God worked this out for good, and this was actually a good thing in my life. It brought me closer to God. But those are not in themselves good things. Jesus dying is not a good thing. It's a loving thing. And God uses love to produce goodness in our life. Again, I see everything as subject to God's love. And if I ever ask myself, why did God do something? He always answers, well, why is it the most loving thing for me to do this? That's something that God gave me a long time ago. It was really weird. Like, I was asking him certain things about why. Like, you don't understand a person through what he does. You understand why he did it. Of course, you can't understand through what he does. Ultimately, that's how we understand God the Father, is through Jesus Christ dying for our sins. But you get a better understanding of why God did something, of who God is, when you understand why. There was something profound that God revealed to me one time when I was writing a poem, that he did not love me so that I could love him. It's a bonus, and it's beautiful when we do love God back. But the same way a parent loves a child in order to instill love into that child, to teach the child love, and to help the child grow and become mature. It's the same way with God. Like, the reason he does these things is in order for us to grow and mature in love. And that can only happen specifically through Jesus Christ, because he's our ultimate example of love. You cannot do something that you've never been taught to do. You cannot do something that you've never seen before. It's never come into your mind. And the type of love that Jesus gives is godly love, and it's never been seen before here on earth. Specifically because he comes from such a high position in order to save those from in such a low position. That's why I believe it's impossible to love God as much as he loves us, because we're bottom up, not top to bottom. So we don't give up. We can never give up enough, because we don't have enough, if that makes sense. But specifically here, when we say God is love, it's not God is good like it's an adjective. It's God the noun is love the noun. This is in John. You can go look it up. The tense is really clear, and I believe this is because I didn't know how to prove it to people. One day I was looking at love, and I was trying to find out how to prove it to people, and then I was like, oh, let me look in the Greek, see if this matches with what I believe. And he says God the noun is love the noun, theos and then agape. So it's really interesting. Search it out, and I guarantee you it'll be in there. That's the wonderful thing, is the Bible is a tool in order to help us clarify God, or clarify our own beliefs. Because again, it'd be really hard for me to tell somebody that holiness is not God's ultimate attributes if we didn't have those two Bible verses where it says the angels long to look into the things of God, the things that we understand naturally. And it'd be really hard for me, especially without that verse in John that says God, the noun, is love, the noun. So just think about it. It's something that God showed me. I plan to make a categories. I don't know. Because I know that certain attributes trump other attributes in God. Like love trumps mercy. Love trumps judgment. Because, God tells us, love through mercy. God says mercy triumphs over judgment. And holiness is beaten by grace. You see what I'm saying? Or justice, rather, is beaten by grace. This is a very important distinction. We read about God, and what does he say about himself? He says he says the just for the unjust. In other words, Christ, the perfect, for us, the imperfect. That's not just. In God's eyes, it is completely just because his justice derives from his, not from his holiness, but rather from his love. So God is just in the ultimate way. And again, like Paul does wonderful, beautiful, like logic things. It's really cool if you read Romans. He does wonderful, beautiful logic things. Like through one disobedience, we all became sinners. We all became partakers in sin through the disobedience of Adam. And through one act of righteousness, which is Jesus Christ dying for our sins, we receive life eternal. It's a really beautiful thing. Like if you think about it, God's always had that balance. You know what I'm saying? Like one for one. So it does conform with justice in God's mind because he sees justice differently from you. Again, we don't kick our children out of the house if they eat a piece of fruit that we told them not to eat. But that's exactly what happened. Adam ate a piece of fruit. He got kicked out of paradise. So this is a very important distinction in order for us to understand. God sees things totally different. In God's mind, all sins are the same. Even the ones committed in the mind and even the ones committed, even the lesser ones, like stealing a penny, is the same as stealing $1 million. So that's a verse in James where one person who is guilty of breaking one commandment breaks them all, because the same person who said do not steal said do not covet. So this is who God is, and again we can see that in what God has done. So it's the Bible is a wonderful tool in order for God to clarify the things that he's showing us. He showed me before, like, I don't know, like I just believed it. I believed God's ultimate attribute was love, and I mean I tried to prove it, and when I tried to prove it, one of the terms that I had to use, or one of the tools that I had to use, was the Bible. So it's a wonderful tool. Don't neglect it. Also, meditation and talking to God, reasoning with God. He says, "Come and reason with me." So he does want us to reason with him what these things are, and just ask yourself, like, what attribute is highly praised in the Gospels and also in the epistles, and we know it's love. Like what Paul says about love is some of the most beautiful stuff ever written, and that's what it is. Just think about it, pray about it. Don't harden your heart if you are one of those people that believes holiness. Just take it for what it is. It's just another belief of mine. Maybe in my particular ministry, in my particular walk with God, I have to believe that. Otherwise, I can't perform the work that I perform. Maybe other pastors also, like, I believe wholeheartedly what Paul said. Like, he tells us that if you don't believe it, God will lead you in that direction also. This is a verse in Philippians. Like, near the end of Paul's life, he's starting to see that he's not necessary. Like, not that way, because again, like, I would hate it if someone ever called my work for God unnecessary, but it was a bunch of weight on his shoulders. He believed that he had to do everything. And here he was in prison, and people were still getting things accomplished. They were still trusting in God. They were still preaching the gospel. Mighty things were happening with him in prison. And he saw that God was leading his church. And that's what he believed. You know, he believed that Christ was the head of the church, just like man is the head of a woman. So he believed this, and he got to see it before he died, and he knew the end was coming. This was when he was in prison for the last time, getting ready to die. And he believed he was going to let go. It's terrible, but I mean, he did believe that. He didn't know exactly what was going to happen at that point when he was writing. But he saw it, and he said, if you believe anything else also, I believe God will reveal it to you. So there's wonderful words from a man who knew God so intimately that he didn't have a wife. He saw the church as his children. He saw the church as his glory rather than a wife. A man sees a wife as his glory, just like God sees a man as his glory. And he stayed single, and he encouraged some to stay single because it would procure undevoted distraction to the Lord. So someone who is that close to God, his words, not just because he's an apostle, like, I understand he's an apostle and a lot of people put themselves under the authority of him, but see what he's saying. Like, judge Paul's heart in this statement when he says God will reveal it to you also. He's not lording it over you that he's an apostle. He's not saying believe me because of the miracles that I've done. And he's not saying believe me because of what I've suffered. He's saying, submit yourself to God, and God will reveal it to you. Like he knows he doesn't have any power. All his power comes from God, and he was trusting that Christ was able to reveal it to them. That's a very humble attitude. And if the apostle was willing to do it, the apostle Paul, in my opinion, very close to Jesus. You know what I'm saying? Like very, very close. It's a really beautiful relationship that he had with Jesus. And we should be jealous of that relationship. We should want to be as close to Jesus as Paul was, and even closer. Like, why would I want to be as close as he is if I can get even closer? And that's what he ultimately wanted. Paul's heart was for us to draw strength from Jesus. That's why he says, I can do all things through the Lord who strengthens me. That's also in Philippians. And that's why he encourages us to share our emotions and our feelings with God, because God does love us. He wants us to share our worries, our concerns, and God will give us his peace. He's not saying these things as a direction from God. It's not like God said, tell them these things. He's saying these things because he's experienced them in his walk with Christ. And he knows that if God was faithful to him, he'll be faithful to us. Because God doesn't love any one of us more than the other. It's only our love for him that's different. Some people might love him more, some people might love him less. And this is again what Jesus said, to whom was forgiven much, loves much. I personally see myself as the worst kind of sinner. Like, I knew God existed. God literally showed me miracles before I was a Christian, and I was still an atheist. Like, I would not believe in him. Miracles, answered prayers, like ridiculous. Like, he told me the future, it was ridiculous, and I still didn't care. The only thing that made a difference was not the knowledge of God. It was not his holiness. It was not his wrath. It was not any sort of attribute. It wasn't even his forgiveness, man. It was ultimately him reaching out to me in love. I saw him alone dying on the cross, and that's why I became a Christian. Like, I knew someone that was that alone, and someone like me was also very alone. Like, I was made for him, and he was made for me. It's a beautiful thing. Like, I hope I don't start crying, but we're made for each other. And I think that's a wonderful thing. Like, that's something that only happens in love. Like Adam and Eve. She was made for him. She was his rib. I mean, I call myself Jesus' rib all the time. Like, I was taken out from his side when he was stabbed with the spear. It's a wonderful, beautiful thing that God was reliving. He was showing us, hey, what did I do for Adam? I made him go to sleep and I took him out of the side. What did I do for Jesus? I made him go to sleep and I took you out of his side. It's a cute little thing. I don't know. Like, again, I'm not going to be able to prove that to you, but everything repeats. And there's a reason it happened in the beginning, and there's a reason it happened when Jesus said it is finished and breathed his last. I believe I came out of Jesus, and we belong together from eternity past to eternity future. There's nothing that can separate me from the love of God. Just pray about it, think about it. Again, there's more. Like, I'm willing also to look at it. You know what I'm saying? Holiness is a wonderful thing. Like, before, of course, how else could I see it? Like, if I saw God's ultimate attribute of holiness, I'm a ruined man. I'm an unclean man of unclean lips. I can't draw near to God. You know what I'm saying? What is it that people in the Old Testament saw? They saw holiness. What was it that the angels were saying about God was holy, holy, holy? And what is it that the prophet says? I think it's Jeremiah, when he goes and talks to God. He says, I am an unclean man of unclean lips. And I'm sorry, man. Like, ultimately, when God's grace does lead me to repentance and I come to God, I do feel that way. But then he makes me feel so amazing afterwards. He's like, no, man, I love you and I accept you no matter what. That doesn't come from holiness, because holiness, there's division. In love, there's unity. Thanks.